how you want to engage a backup buyer. Okay, now let's go into my zip form. Zip form right here. I'll use one of the examples that I created recently. I'll try a different one. How about I go into this folder, Orange Blossom. This is actually one of the recent listings that I have. Is in Orange. I mean, it's in Irvine. It's a 464 Orange Blossom. This is a condo. This may be a hot market, but for condominium, maybe it's not selling as quickly as single-family residence. That's why it's important for me to have the backup buyer engaged. How do you engage a backup buyer? So I had 2 offers accepted and both buyers canceled. Okay, I'm on my 3rd buyer right now. So when I had my first buyer, I had a backup buyer. So my backup buyer canceled. Before my backup buyer canceled, I engaged them. The way to engage a backup buyer is to keep them in communication, because if you don't keep them in communication, you may lose them to other properties. Well, even when you're engaging them, there's no guarantee that you won't lose them to other properties. When you have a backup buyer, there is a legal document that you have to sign with the backup buyer to create a legal relationship between a buyer and a seller. And that document is known as a backup addendum. Okay, this is what backup addendum looks like. Okay, backup offer addendum right here. So the way to create a legal relationship between a seller and a backup buyer is to execute 2 documents. Legally speaking, there is no legal relationship between a seller and a backup buyer unless both parties sign a backup offer addendum and both parties signs the offer submitted by the backup buyer. So you must sign the offer submitted the backup buyer like you are signing an actual contract, because it is going to be a contract. Now, if you are a buyer in a backup position, and if you only sign a backup offer addendum, it doesn't mean that you don't have a contract. In fact, just signing the backup offer addendum may create some kind of legal relationship already. But if you are representing the backup buyer and you don't even have a backup offer addendum signed, all you got is just an email from the listing agent saying that, oh, you are going to be the backup buyer number 1. But the problem is there is no legal signed document. You don't have a signed document. So to create a legally binding document, especially if you are a buyer in this market, you are in a backup offer number 1 position, you got to sign this one. Now, what does this one say? Well, you fill out the form like you do. This is an addendum to the residential purchase agreement. And it would have a date on it. And it has the property address. Have the seller's name and then have the buyer's name. And then in here, you have to state position number 1, or whatever the position may be. You could have more than 1 backup buyers, but I'll tell you though, experience tells you that many buyers would not want to become backup offer number 2 or lower. They want to become backup number 1. So that's why stating a number here is important. And then here there's a blank space here. What is the importance of this blank space? Well, the importance of this blank space is it gives both parties a date. How do you determine this date? You determine this date here. Here I put April 26 because that's the contingency removal date for the buyer who has a binding contract with us. So both the seller and the backup buyer can count on this date. If by this date the seller did not deliver a copy of the cancellation of the contract between the seller and the original buyer, then either side may cancel this contract. It is a contract. So that's why you need to put a date here. Okay? And then you're going to fill out everything else. Now, if in fact the previous buyer cancels, then you can go ahead and fill out the middle portion here, notice of cancellation of prior contract. So you don't actually have to create another document. You can just go ahead and put the notice of cancellation of prior contract right on this form. But that is to be filled out at a later point in time. Sometimes the buyer may cancel sooner than the date, the April 26th date. It happened to me in this particular deal. The first buyer actually canceled, I think, within 5 days after the escrow was open. So we actually notify the buyer in a backup position about the cancellation. But of course, since I already received a written cancellation from the original buyer, I really never took the trouble to fill out this form because the backup buyer opened escrow with us anyway, so we don't have a legal situation. But to be legal, you should go ahead and fill out this part of it if the previous buyer cancels. Okay, so that's how you use a backup addendum form. Okay, and again, I just want to remind you, not only must you sign the backup offer addendum, you must also remember to have both the seller and the backup buyer sign the original offer submitted by the backup buyer. Okay, together with the backup offer addendum, they form a legal binding contract. Okay, so legally speaking, the backup buyer is not supposed to enter into another contract. Okay, while they are waiting to see if the current buyer will cancel. But as a practical matter, they may continue to look for other properties. The reason is most of them still have a certain contingency that they can use to cancel this contract. So even though they have a binding contract with your seller, but what's preventing them from looking for other properties? Nothing, because they can always come back to you and say, oh, Kenny, sorry, my buyer needs to cancel because they find something about the property they don't like, and there's nothing you can do about it, even though there's a legal contract. But the seller, on the other hand, is different though. The seller can't come back to the buyer and say, hey, I changed my mind, I don't want to sell it to you. So this backup offer addendum is actually more important to the buyer than it is to the seller, because for the seller, hey, the buyer can cancel anytime. For the buyer, it's a different story. The seller can't cancel on them because it's legally binding on the seller. Certainly, well, from the backup buyer's point of view is that once this document is signed and is indicated to be backup offer position number 1, the seller is bound by this backup contract, because even if another buyer comes in, offer a higher price, they are stuck with this backup buyer's price.